I slept with my half-sister, now she's pregnant, and my wife has no idea. The rain was coming down in sheets when I heard the knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, least of all her. But there she was, standing on my porch, soaked to the bone and smiling like she'd just won the lottery. "Clara?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, big brother," she replied, her tone light but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Mind if I come in?" I stepped aside, letting her into the warmth of the house. She shook out her hair, sending droplets of water flying, and shrugged off her jacket. I couldn't help but notice how much she'd changed. The last time I'd seen her, we were kids, running through the fields behind our grandparents' house, chasing fireflies and laughing like there was no tomorrow. Now, she was a woman, confident and self-assured, with a presence that filled the room. "What are you doing here?" I asked, still trying to process her sudden appearance. She shrugged, her eyes scanning the room. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. Is that okay?" "Of course," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if it was. It's been a long time." "Too long," she agreed, her gaze settling on me. There was something in her eyes, something that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. "You look good, by the way." "Thanks," I muttered, suddenly self-conscious. "You too." We spent the next few hours catching up, talking about everything and nothing. She told me about her life, her job, her travels. I told her about mine, my wife, Sarah, my job at the firm, the house we bought last year. It was all surface-level stuff, the kind of small talk you make with someone you haven't seen in years. But there was an undercurrent to our conversation, a tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. When she left that night, promising to come back soon, I stood at the door for a long time, watching her car disappear into the rain. I told myself it was nothing, just two siblings reconnecting after years apart. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few weeks, Clara became a regular presence in my life. She'd show up unannounced, always with a smile and a story to tell. Sarah didn't seem to mind. In fact, she seemed to like Clara, which only made me feel worse. "She's great," Sarah said one night as we lay in bed. "It's nice that you're reconnecting with her." "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight. "It is." But it wasn't just reconnecting. There was something else, something I couldn't name. It was in the way Clara looked at me, the way her laughter lingered a little too long, the way her hand brushed against mine when she passed me a cup of coffee. It was in the way my heart raced when she was near, the way I found myself thinking about her when she wasn't there. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But the truth was I wasn't. And the worst part was, I didn't want to stop. Clara's visits became more frequent, her presence in my life more constant. She'd show up at my office with lunch, or call me late at night just to talk. At first, I told myself it was harmless, just a sister reconnecting with her brother. But as the days turned into weeks, it became harder to ignore the way she made me feel. It was in the little things. The way she'd lean in a little too close when we talked, her breath warm against my ear. The way her laughter would linger, filling the silence between us. The way her eyes would meet mine, holding my gaze a moment longer than necessary. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And it was driving me crazy. Sarah didn't seem to notice. She was too busy with work, too wrapped up in her own world to see the cracks forming in ours. And maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions of a life that wasn't really mine. Clara saw me. She saw me in a way no one else did, and it was intoxicating. One evening, Clara came over for dinner. Sarah had made her famous lasagna, and the three of us sat around the table, laughing and talking like old friends. But there was a tension in the air, a current that ran beneath the surface of our conversation. I could feel it every time Clara's foot brushed against mine under the table, every time her hand lingered on my arm as she passed me a dish. After dinner, Sarah went to bed early, leaving Clara and me alone in the living room. We sat on the couch, a bottle of wine between us, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation turned to our childhood, to the summers we'd spent together at our grandparents' house. "Do you remember the treehouse?" Clara asked, her voice soft. "Of course," I replied, smiling at the memory. "We spent hours up there, pretending it was a castle or a spaceship or whatever we could imagine. It was our escape, she said, her eyes distant. A place where we could be whoever we wanted to be. There was a pause, a silence that stretched between us like a thread pulled taut. And then, without warning, Clara leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a long kiss, or a deep one, but it was enough to send a shockwave through my body. I pulled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling. "Clara, what are you doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of desire and defiance. "I'm tired of pretending," she said. "Aren't you?" I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, fear, longing. I wanted to push her away, to tell her this was wrong, that we couldn't do this. But another part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to pull her closer, to give in to the temptation that had been building between us. In the end, I did neither. I just sat there, frozen, as Clara stood up and walked out the door, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, I lay in bed beside Sarah, staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still feel Clara's lips on mine, still hear her voice in my head. "Aren't you tired of pretending?" The truth was I was tired of pretending that everything was fine, that my life was perfect, that I was happy. But I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know how to fix what was broken, or if it could even be fixed. All I knew was that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I wasn't sure if I could stop myself from falling. After that night, everything changed. Clara didn't come around as often, and when she did, there was a tension between us that neither of us acknowledged. But it was there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. I tried to pretend it hadn't happened, to go back to the way things were before. But it was impossible. Every time I looked at Clara, I saw the way her lips had felt against mine, the way her eyes had burned with a fire I couldn't ignore. And every time I looked at Sarah, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. I told myself I could control it, that I could keep my feelings in check. But I was lying to myself. The truth was, I didn't want to control it. I wanted to give in, to let myself feel something, anything, other than the numbness that had taken over my life. It happened on a night I'll never forget. Sarah was out of town, visiting her sister, and Clara came over, unannounced as usual. We sat on the couch, a bottle of wine between us, talking about nothing in particular. But there was an electricity in the air, a tension that had been building for weeks. And then, without warning, Clara leaned in and kissed me again. This time, I didn't pull away. This time, I kissed her back. What followed was a blur of emotions, of touches and whispers and moments that felt both wrong and right at the same time. I told myself it was just one night, that it wouldn't happen again. But it did. Again and again, until I was caught in a spiral I couldn't escape. The guilt was overwhelming. Every time I looked at Sarah, I felt like a fraud, like I was living a lie. But I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I couldn't bear the thought of hurting her, of destroying the life we'd built together. So I kept quiet, burying my guilt deep inside me, where it festered and grew. But secrets have a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to keep them hidden. One evening, Clara showed up at my house, her face pale and her hands trembling. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me a piece of paper. It was a pregnancy test, the kind with 2 lines that change everything. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at the test, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it was, and there was no going back. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice shaking. Clara looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I don't know," she said. "But we can't keep pretending this isn't real." That night, I lay in bed beside Sarah, staring at the ceiling. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, fear, longing. I wanted to tell her the truth, to confess everything and beg for her forgiveness. But I couldn't. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her, of losing everything we'd built together. But I also couldn't keep living this lie.